Hello everyone. Just give it a couple of seconds while we fill up our virtual town hall for a very different Australia at Home session today. I'll talk to you all about that in a second. We're actually going to make you work rather than just give you a compelling narrative about the world, although there's many more of those to come over the next few weeks, which I'll also tell you about. My name's Peter Lewis, I'm Director of Essential Media. Before we get cracking, as always, I do want to recognise that wherever we're joining today, we're on Indigenous land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and I know that you'll all join with me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, and to recognise the land we're all on was never ceded. Now, we've been building this community for the best part of a year now. We started this, I think, in March when the lockdown started. And one of the ideas I've always had is this is a place to come together, but it's also a place where we can get real value out of giving you an opportunity to feed back into debate. So one of the things we've always been keen to do is get people into discussions, but today we're taking it another step. And what we're doing today is working with our friends at Energy Consumers Australia, ACOS, and the Total Environment Centre to have you take part in a consultation with them about the citizen voice in energy, which seems like a very, I know, ephemeral idea, but as we go through the session today, hopefully it begins to make sense of you, because I think one of the challenges in talking about energy is that we actually just see it as something we buy rather than something we're part of. So with Chris and Kelly and Mark today, we're going to take you through a process which is a little bit different than normal. We're going to be working through some really interesting ideas, but along the way, we're going to be asking you to feed back through using, which we've never done in Australia at Home, our polling function, but also to be encouraging you to be really active in the chat today. These guys are actually paying me to run this process as well. So this helps fund Australia at Home. So even while it's a bit different, you participating in this is actually helping to support the project that we've all been working together on for the best part of this year. We might go a little bit longer than the hour today. If you can stay around, that would be great. We'll definitely be done by 2:30, but if you do need to drop off, we will be emailing a survey out to you at the end of proceedings as well. So in the spirit of just getting things moving and getting you used to participating rather than just, I don't know what we do in these rooms, watch, listen, be part of a conversation. It'd be great if people just introduce themselves in chat. And the first question we just want to know is, how much do you know about the way Australia's energy system works? And if you can all just go in there and put just a line or two about that, that's a really great way of grounding the discussion. And then we will come back as we go through some of the presentations from Mark, Kelly and Chris to ask some questions on survey as well, which will give us a little bit more quant. Now, I've said to these guys, we're probably not a normal audience. Like, I don't think we're a representative sample of the Australian population, but we are an engaged group of citizens who care about the world around us and are engaged in ideas and like supporting each other. And in terms of thinking through how people fit into the energy market, you guys aren't a bad place to start. So let's get into it. Let's see how we go. As always, things are probably going to go wrong, but bear with us because we're making this up. This is our first ever community consult, and if we get it right, maybe you will find more and more ways of having your voice really heard by people who are developing public policy. So before we jump into it, I'll just introduce our three kind of collaborators. I won't call them the Three Musketeers, but they are three people from kind of different parts of civil society who have been working together. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Kelly Court, who's the Senior Advisor, Climate and Energy with ACOS. So Kelly, hi, thanks for being part of today. I'm really interested just if you share with the guys a little bit about yourself and why ACOS is involved in this process. And of course, the most important thing is we want one fun energy fact from you.
Thanks, Peter, and hi everyone. Really pleased to be in this virtual town hall with all you people. Really looking forward to your feedback. So I work for ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service, and our vision is to end poverty and inequality and create a fair, sustainable, resilient and inclusive society. So for ACOS and our members, we really do support the rapid transition to clean energy as part of our fair share to reduce global warming, but it has to be done equitably, and we need to make sure that no one is left behind in this energy transition. And we believe if we get it right for people experiencing disadvantage, then we get it right for everyone. And our worry is that the focus on this transition has really been around, you know, the market, competition, technology and choice, rather than really focusing on what people want and what people need. So that gives you a sense of where we're coming from, and as Chris will talk a little bit later as to why we've developed a new energy compact, and we're keen for your views on it. So my fun fact is that Australia is leading the world in rooftop solar installations. So we have over 2 million rooftop households with rooftop solar, which is 21% of households. So that's quite a lot. And, you know, in leading the world in this transition, what we do here, other countries are looking to.
Fantastic, and thanks, Kelly, for your work in this space. Next, I'll introduce Mark Byrne, who's joining us from up in Byron, I believe. Mark is an energy market advocate with the Total Environment Centre. Hi, Mark. How's things up in the beautiful New South Wales North Coast today?
Hi, Peter, and hi, everyone else. Not quite as far up as Byron, but my fun fact is that right about now we're due to be hit by large hailstones. So if I run screaming, it's because I need to do something to the house.
Excellent. Well, that will add a level of excitement that we may not have been expecting today, but hopefully we can duck and cover and get through that. And what brings Total Environment Centre into this discussion and this process, Mark?
We've been funded since 2004 to work on the environmental outcomes in the national electricity market. So using what used to be called demand-side management, energy efficiency, energy conservation to reduce the environmental impact of the NEM. And that's mostly around reducing carbon emissions. And we think that that can be done while also being of interest or being in the long-term interest of consumers, which is the objective of the national electricity market. Everything's supposed to operate in the long-term interest of consumers. And like ACOS and like ECA, we think that good environmental outcomes and good consumer outcomes are not mutually exclusive.
Fantastic. We're going to get a bit more of a deep dive with you on how the market's changing in just a second. Finally, I'd like to introduce Chris Alexander, who's the Director of Strategic Reform at Energy Consumers Australia. Chris, people may not be aware of ECA and their work. Do you want to just sort of give your elevator pitch on ECA and what you guys bring to the table, and also, of course, your fun fact?
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for giving up your lunchtime to be part of this conversation. So ECA was actually set up by energy ministers about 5 years ago as a small kind of little expert organisation that was essentially to keep the big energy companies and the other organisations that run the market on your behalf honest. So that's what we've typically done. Now, in the context of this big transition where the actual system itself is changing, we're increasingly being asked to kind of comment on, well, what should the future look like? And for us to be able to do that, we need to know what people want. Hence this project, hence working with Peter on the kind of customer expectation work and vision work like this. And my fun fact is, and Peter will know this because his organisation does the work for us, is that we poll people and ask them how much they trust energy companies. Are they getting value for money? And we ask them to compare that to other services, internet, insurance, banking, water, there's a couple of others. And it turns out people trust their energy provider less than the banks, which, given we've been through royal commissions and all the rest of it, is quite a jarring fact.
So I guess the upside of that is things are starting from a very low base anyway, Chris.
Yeah, you're ever the optimist, Peter. That's a good way to think.
Always. So look, before we get into our presentations, we're just going to test the polling and ask you guys a couple of questions. We've never done this before, so fingers crossed it doesn't fall in a heap. But Caitlin, do you want to put the first polling question up, which is we're going to ask you a couple of really basic questions. You can just quickly fill out one of those. And obviously this is all confidential, so we're not going to link this to anybody. This is not about finding a way of selling you cheaper energy or anything. We're just really interested to get a mix of the room and where people feel in the spectrum here. So basically, in terms of where you're feeling, in terms of your financial situation, where you think you're doing okay, things are a bit of a struggle, or things are a bit of a stretch. And the results are coming in. It shows that we've got probably a slightly more comfortable audience than the national average. I don't know if everyone gets to see this, but I reckon we've closed it. Share those results and you get to see that we're 74% doing okay, 19% can manage bills but struggle to afford anything else, 6% under financial pressure. Let's go to the second question. Did everyone see that, by the way? Nod your head if you did. Great. Do you own or rent your current home? I am thinking we've got a lot of owners here, but let's say own with mortgage, own without a mortgage, rent. Aren't these cool little things you get to
And Peter, these questions are really helpful for us because, you know, for people that rent or can't afford you know, that extra bit of money, it's hard for them to potentially participate in their future energy system, like get access to rooftop solar and batteries and stuff like that. So this really helps us when we're, you know, thinking about the energy future.
All right, I reckon, Caitlin, we can share the results of that one with everyone. So we've got, you know, and I don't think it's a secret, we've got a kind of more mature audience, all of the regular Australia at home. So the fact that a lot of you own without a mortgage is fantastic, but probably not necessarily representative of the broader populace. The final question that though goes with that, and for now, just the one about rooftop solar. And I saw in the chat quite a few people that are on the call are producers of energy, but if people like to just answer this particular question, and I think also some of the people that aren't Australia at home regulars might be people that are interested in energy who will have solar panels installed. But we've got, look at that. Very few people not interested, but that'd be an interesting thing to find. If you're not interested in installing, please feel free to share that in the chat as well. John's saying he can't see the questions. One of our tech support, Hannah, might send you a note, John, just to let you know what you could be doing wrong there. And now we're going to share that result. 43% of the people in the room have rooftop solar panels already installed. 49% don't but are interested. So there's your captive market, and 8% are not interested. There was a really interesting bit of feedback there as well. Not interested because I live in an apartment from Colin, that makes sense. And unable to install because of a renter. Kelly, that's a real issue, isn't it? There is that sense that it's kind of a rich person's sport at the moment.
Yeah, wealthier people, though, you know, a lot of people on lower income and middle income have sought to seek out rooftop solar because it's a good way to manage their electricity bills, and you know, we see opportunity going forward, but then there needs to be support for people who can't afford it and for renters.
So everyone's seen those results. We've shared those. So that's our first little bit of feedback. What I'm going to do now, though, is invite Mark from Total Environment Centre to sort of give us the overview of how the energy market has changed over the last decade or so. I'm going to share a screen on this because when we did a run through on this, guys, and the first thing we realised is this is kind of complex stuff, and you've got to be with the top line shift before the rest of the discussion makes sense. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it comes up beautifully, and then we'll see Mark's lovely head on the top of the screen. Are we all there? Are we getting there? Can we see that PowerPoint, or are we still struggling? We got it now? All right, Mark, energy transition in 3 to 6 words, all on this one beautiful slide.
Yeah, so this is a few dimensions of the transition that's happening at the moment, which is probably once in a generation, maybe once in a century transition, and it's great to be part of the economy that's changing so rapidly, although not rapidly enough to lead us down a path of a safe climate at this point. But putting that to one side, I've identified 3 dimensions of the transition here. We're moving from fossil fuels, coal and gas, to renewable energy. We're moving from a centralised to a decentralised system, and we're moving in the system as well as at home from relatively dumb things to relatively smart things. There's a fourth.
So what do you mean by that, Mark? Dumb to smart?
Well, if you take meters or inverters, for instance, meters used to be able to only accumulate data until they were read, and then read again every 3 months, and now they can talk to the network or talk to retailers, maybe once every minute, and send live data about how you're going, and you can access those in some cases through web portals. So inverters have always been passive. Go on. I had one more.
So let's
up there as well. Yeah. And that was just what's known as the electrification of everything. So electricity is already important in modern life, but we're gradually seeing more and more dependence on electricity. And a couple of examples of that would be the move to all electric homes away from gas, and the shift from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles.
Electric cars. Which will really change if we're having to charge our cars overnight. That's going to be a total change of the way we use an energy grid, isn't it?
Yes, and by the same token, more and more we're going to see electric vehicles which can be acting like mobile batteries and can actually feed power into the grid. And so that might overtake the need for household batteries in the future.
While we're talking through this, if things that we're talking about don't make sense to people, you put it in the chat, because it's really important that we get a way of pitching this discussion at a level that makes sense to you guys. So please pull us up, and I'll get Mark to expand when we start talking in ways that don't make sense to you. So I've now put up almost a graph that shows the way energy used to work, which is kind of pretty straightforward, isn't it, Mark? You dig stuff up, you burn it, and it creates power, and it gets to the home.
That's right. It was based on a small number of very large fossil fuel burning power stations, often hundreds of kilometres away from the main population centres, sending energy through the transmission network and then down through the distribution network to the home or the business, with the retailer in the middle there kind of clipping the ticket and sending you your bill. And that's what's changing now.
And then we'll have a look at the system now, which looks a lot more complex. And I don't think you need, I think in one way this graph shows the complexity, but just talk this through top line.
Yeah, complexity is one of the features of the decentralized energy system. Electricity is complicated. Electricity markets are more complicated, and now the changes that we're making are making it even more complicated. So that creates opportunities, but also challenges, which we'll talk about in a minute. So apart from the complexity, the main things to note about this slide are that you've got energy moving 2 ways, or not just down the supply chain, but up the supply chain, from consumers back into the grid, but also across the supply chain. So between consumers and consumers on grid, we've also got increasing numbers likely to go off grid in the near future, whether it's onto standalone power systems or microgrids. So it's becoming a lot more complex. The other thing to note about this one is that although it's got a building in the middle there, which looks like a jail or a McMansion, it's supposed to represent customers. So the whole point of the energy transition is that customers are at the centre now, whereas they used to be kind of at the periphery.
Well, they were at the end of the line, weren't they?
Yeah.
And now, so that's us. This is a graph of what the home could look like into the future. Just want to sort of, the one bit I don't get here is the inverter.
Oh, well, you need an inverter to to convert your DC energy back to AC to put into the house, and then just to put into the grid any excess you've got.
So that's kind of the two-way channel, yeah?
Yeah. Basically at the household level, as well as solar, batteries and electric cars, we're seeing more smart meters, as I said, smart inverters. We can talk to the inverter manufacturers and can take signals from the market operator. Inside the home, we're seeing smart thermostats, in-home energy management systems, and then digital assistants like Siri and Alexa, as well as more energy efficient appliances. So the home is gradually changing, but outside the home as well. I don't have a separate slide for this. We're seeing more interest in trading energy locally with neighbours, called peer-to-peer trading, being part of a virtual power plant. If you've got a battery, you can pull that battery energy and sell it into the wholesale market. And finally, building community-scale batteries and shared what are called solar gardens, which will help people who don't own their own energy resources, including, as was mentioned earlier, renters and apartment dwellers who can't own solar directly.
So the same way as you might have a community garden for people that don't have a backyard, you might have a community solar farm for people that don't have the opportunity to have their own rooftop.
That's right. And with batteries as well, you might just, if you've got extra solar, put it into the battery, and then somebody who doesn't have solar can pull it out.
Yeah,
so
great.
Sharing that energy locally.
Final slide where you sum up the risks.
Yeah, so the opportunities and also the challenges or risks of the energy transition. In the long run, it's likely that energy will be cheaper because renewable energy has almost zero marginal cost. Consumers are going to have more choices and will be able to have more control over how they interact with the system. The shift will also increase the wider decarbonisation of the economy, as we move to renewables. And as we rely more on local energy, the system's likely to be more resilient to climate change impacts like bushfires, cyclones and floods. So there's some of the good things. On the other hand, there are some challenges or risks, and I've just put up a couple there. As we said, the system is becoming more complex, and there's a number of technical challenges to system security that have been coming up that need to be dealt with, like voltage spikes. And for consumers, complexity can lead to confusion, which means that it can be difficult for many consumers to interact with the new system, especially, say, if you're elderly or non-English speaking background. So we have to kind of think about people who don't want to participate in this more complex but more choice-oriented new world. And the last one is that somebody has to pay for all this. So there's the technical issues around the decentralised system, but there's also a lot of investment in large-scale transmission level resources that's going to be needed over the next 20 years or so to make this transition work effectively. And there's a kind of equity concern here because people with solar and batteries and electric cars can, to some extent, opt out of paying for the system because they're relying on their own resources. And the fear is that that will leave people who are kind of who don't have these resources, who are stuck on the main old grid, left with the task of paying these costs. So we have to make sure that the costs are, well, first of all, that everyone can participate as much as possible, but then for the people who can't participate directly, that they're not saddled with a bill for things that other people aren't having to face directly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mark. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll come back to later because we'll do a bit of an open mic after Chris's presentation before we get into the real hard work of going through the elements of the compact. But the one question the number of people asked, Mark, was just the idea of a car as an energy producer. How far off is that, and what would be involved in that?
One of my favourite topics. It's called vehicle to home or vehicle to grid, depending on where the energy is going back to. But the idea first came up in Japan after the Fukushima nuclear crisis, when they needed to rely more on other sources of energy. And the first Nissan Leaf did have this capability. It hasn't got a lot further yet, but it's likely to over the next 5 or 10 years. And I know EMA, the market operator, is working on protocols to make sure that cars coming to Australia can do it, but it isn't happening just yet. So I'd say probably 5 years minimum, 10 years maximum, but it's got huge potential because your average home battery is about 10 kilowatt hours. Your average electric car battery is 50 plus. So it's a huge battery potentially.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks for that. I'm going to call up Chris now just because we need to keep the agenda moving on. So Chris, I'm not going to use an expletive. What is a compact? What are we trying to achieve through this process? So I guess the what and the why is really important before we dig any deeper.
Yeah, so I guess before we get to the what and the why of the compact, it's just why do we care so much about energy in particular? And I guess Mark's got to it, but essentially energy is one of those things that sort of sits in the background of our lives. But the way it gets into our home, how much we pay for it, how we use it, really has a massive impact potentially. We've got a 14-week-old baby in the house at the moment. I've become obsessed with like temperature and our aircon settings and all that sort of stuff. I'm at my in-laws' place, which is in rural Western Australia. It's pretty hot, 36 degrees on Monday, and the aircon failed, and we went into panic stations here. There's like a tiny kind of disruption or glitch in the equipment in our home, and we're sort of, what are we going to do to manage it? So you can imagine if we're rewiring the system in the kind of way that Mark has just described, and that chart showing what the home could look like. There's all that smart technology now in the home that's linked to the outside world. That is just a radically different new future for us. And I guess our proposition is we all collectively as consumers, as communities, need to have a say in it. And the best way I think for us to have our say is to actually capture what we want, document it in an agreement across the community, and use that as the sort of instruction manual in effect that we give to the experts, the market designers, the policymakers and others who are doing this big new redesign effort. So that is the basic idea of what we're doing here. We want to know what people care about, what their values are, the future they want. We want to document that and then hand it to the people whose job it is to design that new system.
So to be clear, the effect of a compact is almost a formalised way of giving citizens a voice in the way the energy system develops. Like I get that, but what power does that have?
Well, it's interesting. In the first instance, I guess that there's two things. It's the power of the vision and the clarity coming from the community about what they want. There's something about energy, because it's so complicated, that it can remove people from the process. So by just getting that clear voice into the process, that can be really, really powerful. And I think maybe Kelly might come in here, but the other thing, and it becomes a sort of point that we can all rally around and go to governments and say, well, we want you to write some of these ideas into the rules for the new market. So there's a stack of legislation this high, and market rules and standards and all sorts of things that kind of govern what happens behind the curtain in the energy market. We want to take some of these ideas and get them written into that framework.
The only other thing I wanted to throw at you before we go to get some feedback on the idea of community input, it wasn't a couple of decades ago, we were citizens, we owned our energy network and we received it as a service. So there's been this shift to it being a market. We've become consumers that feel like we're paying more. And I don't think we're used to, as consumers, being told we've got any power at all. Like, in a way, we had the power when we were citizens because the government provided the service. So it's kind of, in a little way, a little bit counterintuitive, isn't it, to now go and say to people, you've actually got a say. So I'm really interested in how you respond to that, and also to hear from people whether they have faith that something they engage in is going to make any difference.
Yeah, it's kind of, in a sense, we're saying back to the future a fraction. In the old world, it was all terribly simple. Governments owned all of that infrastructure and delivered power that was, for decades, pretty cheap. All of that infrastructure started, I guess, coming up for renewal in the 80s and 90s, when the thinking was we should privatise things, and that's a way to drive efficiency and competition into the market. The big promise was, if we do this, we'll get cheaper prices and we'll get choice. Now, for many people, they did get cheaper power and they got choice, but for many others, they didn't. And we started coming up against all these practical challenges where it's fine to have choice, but these markets are so complex, how do you navigate it? So we're now at the cusp of another big change, and we want to make sure that those values, now it may be that people want simple, low price power. It may be that people want clean power. We need to know what people want and make sure in this next big shift, this big pivot, because we've kind of got a choice here, Peter. You know, there's a potential here for us to go down a route where people don't have to deal with energy companies anymore because it becomes so cheap because we're all producing it. We've just got to make sure it's sort of shared around equitably. Or we could kind of stay on the path we're at and the existing companies get to define where we head.
But it's almost with Mark's model that we're now feeding in, they actually need us to engage because the whole system's going to rely on us producing through our renewables. So it's almost like a treaty. They've got to sue for peace with us after privatising our infrastructure. They need a deal now to get us back on board, or the thing's not going to work. So
I guess absolutely, because the whole system to work is going to rely on us in a whole new way, because my neighbour might rely on me producing power on my solar panel to get it to them. So I've suddenly got a responsibility. You know, if that responsibility needs to be managed by the market operator or someone outside, really the only way I'm going to take that on and give up that bit of freedom is if there's an agreement between me and the grid and the other members of my community. And the problem is we're starting from this point where we've got no trust in the system as it stands. So we've somehow got to get to a point where we do have a level of trust in a future vision and how we can take it forward.
Are there any models globally that do this well?
It's interesting in terms of the technology, and sort of Kelly alluded to this at the top of the call. I mean, we're right on the forefront in terms of solar penetration and the technology. Where we're probably not as advanced is maybe on some of these community models of working together. So people often will point to Germany, where they've had this kind of big, very explicit energy transition policy that's involved local communities. That's one approach. In the UK, they're quite sophisticated around how they're managing the kind of path to net zero, and they've got kind of legislative frameworks, and they've got their parliament actually is running a bigger kind of process like this on steroids to get people into the decision making. So probably bits and pieces around the world we might borrow or learn from, Peter, but I mean, in many ways, because of where the technology in Australia is headed, we're right on the cutting edge of it.
Yeah, great. We're going to throw another question up, which is kind of foundational, which I can kind of preempt, I think, the response. But Caitlin, do you just want to load up the next polling question, which is, do you trust energy companies and regulators to work in your best interests? And we'll just get a bit of a temperature check here. So we've got a lot of trust, some trust, little trust, no trust at all. It's like Melbourne Cup, little trust and no trust at all are fighting it out here, guys. Not wanting to preempt what other people come up with, of course, and we'll share that in a sec. And then when you filled that out, I'm just interested in people putting in a chat their initial response to this idea of a compact and whether it makes sense with them and whether they think it's a useful thing for us to be developing. So we got about, we're almost up there.
I mean, while people are filling out the poll, Peter, the other way to think about kind of compacts and the theory of it is, you know, we'll give something up in return for something. It's really just a big exchange. And the classic example is, you know, taxation's the price we pay for being a member of society. We get services in return. What's the big new agreement that people want to strike in relation to energy?
So Dave has made a really interesting point that maybe this question should have divvied up between the market bodies and the industry. So I think, you know, and Caitlin can share these results now, but clearly trust is not at high. This reflects the research we do. So maybe we do have a representative group here, Chris, but 52% little trust, 21% some trust, and 27% no trust at all. A lot of trust gets a big fat donut. That, you know, hardly surprising at this moment. Sal has put out there that she trusts the regulators like EEMO more than the retailers. And I guess in a way we do have, you know, what do we call them? The gamekeepers and the poachers there. So not that I want to breed cynicism in this particular consultation. There's been a few questions. We might call a couple of people up just to ask questions and have their say. Thomas, are you there? While we're waiting for Thomas, if he's not, Michelle asked, how does rooftop solar compared to using the grid to take advantage of wind and pumped hydro? Maybe that's a question for you, Mark. Unless the hailstones are dropping there. Have you got that one, Kelly, otherwise?
And hi, Peter, I can unmute myself now.
Oh, hi. How are you?
Hello, my name is Thomas. I work at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre and I'm interested in climate justice. So my question related to what do you see as the best policy measures to deliver benefits to lower income households and reduce emissions at the same time? I'm particularly interested in people who do not own their own home, so they may have agency issues or split incentive issues. I was wondering what you see as the best measures there.
Might throw that one to you, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. And I promise this wasn't a Dorothy Dixer. You and I haven't actually met before, Thomas. I know some of your colleagues, so welcome to this. Look, I think the number one priority for ACOS and a lot of our members at the moment, and it ties in very neatly with economic recovery coming out of COVID, is investing in energy efficiency and energy productivity for low-income homes. So that's being able to help people on low incomes, whether they are in social, so public housing or community housing, or they own their own home but don't have much disposable income, or they rent. So how can we help those households have access to more efficient appliances like hot water systems, heating and cooling, insulation, gap sealing, as well as access to solar? Because we know that a lot of the homes that people live in are really have poor energy efficiency and productivity. And we've done the analysis to show that it can make a significant difference to bills, somewhere between $1,000 and $1,200 a year electricity bills if you can improve the energy efficiency and energy productivity at home. So we've been talking to governments and the COVID Commission about a program to invest in this. And the reason why I said it's important to the economic recovery is energy efficiency projects are extremely job rich. Economists will tell you is actually one of the best ways to create jobs in our economy is to invest in energy efficiency and energy productivity. So that's probably our number one priority at the moment, Thomas, to help people is access this new technology and improve the energy efficiency of their home.
Hey, and Mark's just sent a message that thunderstorm has hit, so he's turned off his power source at the moment, but hopefully we get him back on before the end of the session. A question from John, maybe for you, Chris, which was, who do you actually have the agreement with under a compact, which seems to me a really important thing to clarify?
It's a really good question because generally these compacts don't actually exist on paper. They're a bit of a nod and a wink, kind of an understanding that exists across the community. So to actually take the step like we're doing and write it down is kind of novel. In the first instance, this is something that we would have individual citizens and community groups, organisations like ACOS, TC, others sign on to. So it kind of exists like a document that you can be a part of. I guess you could think about it existing as a bit of a petition in a sense, saying, we the undersigned support these principles and values.
So you did a deal with the the deal is done with the peaks who represent individuals, and then if things, I guess it's more a social license, isn't it, rather than necessarily something that you go to court to enforce.
Yeah, that's right. But ultimately, and this is where Kelly and sort of ACOS's campaigning heritage is so important, is you go and we try and get elements of this compact written into law and into rules. So you would find it kind of, it would, I guess, wind its way into a lot of other places, would be the plan at this point.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just add to that, Peter. Part of the essence of this actually came out of a workshop where we partnered with some of those regulators that one of our participants mentioned before. So we had the Australian Energy Market Commission, the Australian Energy Market Regulator, ARENA, involved in these workshops about listening to what people needed and wanted, and expressed the desire for having a vision and a compact. So a lot of those organisations are on board with doing this. Someone said before, really interestingly, that they trust the regulators more than the energy companies. What's interesting is that regulators are actually bound, though, by legislation. There's an objective in the legislation that they're bound to follow. And that objective doesn't include things like, clean energy or decarbonisation. It doesn't include equity and fairness. So, so they have to follow what's currently in the legislation. What we're trying to do is, with this compact, as they're making decisions, they follow this compact. And that, as Chris said, we can eventually then talk to governments about putting elements of this compact into the legislation. So, it's a step process, but our first priority is we're working really hard with these regulators on this transition, that we want to engage them in this compact. And they're, essentially committed to doing that. So we want to get it right.
Right. I was going to put Patrick on the spot. I hope it's the same Patrick who's put in the chat that he comes from Germany and got a bit of lived experience of the German system. Are you there, Patrick? If you're not, that's fine. No, we haven't got that anymore. Chris, so we're about to enter into sort of looking at the principles. So talk to me about how the principles drive the compact, and then we'll get Kelly to take us through slide by slide. And so we've basically got a series of slides we want to show you guys now. And what we're going to do is shift the chat to being only messaging directly to Caitlin. So, because what we want to do is get a one-word response from you guys, 1 or 2 words of what you think about each of these principles, so that we're not sort of getting people to say, yeah, I agree with so-and-so, that we're just getting your sort of undiluted feedback on each of these. So again, we're going to share the screen. So Chris, if you want to set up the principles, and then we'll get Kelly to start talking through some of the specifics there. So Chris is
now I'm on mute. I'm off mute, which is we hear a lot these days, all doing Zooms. So essentially what we've done with the compact is we've already done a lot of work and consultation with kind of peak bodies and different interest groups, where we essentially said what would be the kind of handful of principles that if policymakers and those regulators are making decisions, that you would want them to follow. And out of all that work pops out essentially these 5 that you see on the screen, and Kelly can step through them. So putting people at the centre, Kelly talked about, in the first instance, it shouldn't be about the market or technology or anything else. It should be about people and their needs. So, our 14-week-old baby in an aircon that works. Long-term and flexible. The way the system is set up, it's very incremental, and they look for the next kind of thing, and you end up potentially with lots of band-aids that kind of might keep the power on, but, does that get us closer to the better future we've talked about? Just and fair, we've had a conversation about the people that could be left behind in a world where you're much more reliant on, quite expensive technology in the first instance to get a good outcome. We also worry about people in jobs that might not exist in the future, how we're going to support them. ensure it works. Mark pointed to this one. I mean, it's not immaterial that we're moving to this kind of, you know, an energy system that looks more like the internet. May be quite a complicated thing to run, you know, software, smart systems, how does it all fit together? And clean as well, clean and healthy, which Kelly's alluded to when she was talking about the importance of healthy, energy efficient homes. And then under those kind of high level principles, and if you go into the documentation, and Kelly will walk us through, we've kind of got some more specific, you know, what might that actually mean in detail. And this is essentially the framework we're consulting on. This collectively is our vision of what the future should be, could be.
All right, well, let's dig a bit deeper. Kelly, take us through what we mean by principle number one, and then we're going to ask, after you've sort of given us the top line, if people can just, in the direct chat, just do a 2 or 3 word reaction to what they're hearing and whether it makes sense to them, whether they need more information, you know, whether they agree with it, basically. So off you go.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I should say that what we haven't put up here is that we also have a vision for the energy system, and people will be able to comment on that if they fill out the 5-minute survey that you'll be sending through later. And the vision that we've come up with is that, you know, the new energy system needs to be inclusive, sustainable energy system that actively improves outcomes for people, the community and the environment. So that's the vision that we've come up with. And then, as Chris said, there's principles that sit under that. And can we go back to the slide before? We have an overarching principle, and that is energy is an essential service. You know, people rely on energy. People and business rely on energy. For business, it's about economic return. For people, it's about, you know, being able to turn the lights on, to be able to cook food, to keep their house warm or cool, to access education, employment, social inclusion. You know, it is really crucial energy. So our overarching principle is that energy is an essential service and everyone has the right to access clean, affordable, dependable energy. So that's our overarching principle. And then to enact that, we have these 5 principles that Chris just went through. So keen for your feedback on that overarching principle, whether you think that, you know, the words we've got in there are important. And then let's...
So before we go across, so jump in chat and just give us that feedback if you can. That'd be really, really useful if you've got a initial feedback to that top line proposition. Okay, into number 1.
Okay, so the first principle is putting people at the centre. So this is really about meeting people's needs, empowering people, making sure people participate, that it's simple, people have agency. So we've sort of described it here as we will meet people where they are and deliver their energy needs. This will be done by understanding them and through engagement with them on the design, operation and delivery of the energy system. We will be honest and transparent about our actions. So we've framed this.
So that seems fairly utopian, Kelly. Like, are there examples where you think people are put at the centre of policy making? Like, or is this something totally new?
Oh God, an example. You put me on the spot there. Chris might have a good response there. I think, you know, people...
I guess all the digital platforms try to put us at the centre and make it seamless, so we'll give them all our data. So there are examples of where design, when the organisation doing the design needs people to engage, they all of a sudden find a way of putting the person at the centre. So if you're a big tech company that needs lots of people in your network, you'll give people what you want. In a way, the energy industry, through Mark's graph, really relies on us being at the centre, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the important thing here, Peter, is that, you know, Mark talked a lot about it's complex and, but, you know, what is trying to happen is provide more choice, but more choice doesn't deliver the energy for everybody, yeah? Not everyone wants to engage in the energy market. They just want to go home and turn their lights on. And then there's a lot of people that there are barriers to being able to engage. That might be because of poor literacy, there might be language barriers, there might be financial barriers. You know, there's a whole lot of reasons why people might not be able to engage. So, you know, I think what's really important that we need to keep coming back to the decision makers and the energy companies is you can't design this system based on those people who can engage and want to engage, that you have to look at the needs of everybody and understand how people actually want to engage in the system, and not just those people that are tech heads and can afford to and can access. So that's, you know, this is really what this is about for us, is it's, you know, thinking about all people.
Great. Do we want to move to the next? So again, feedback. I know I'm sort of giving a bit of my feedback as we go, but it's really interesting because I think the challenge these guys have got is to take the complexity of the industry and then put it into 5 principles that then you can build something around. So you helping us think this through is really, really important. So think long term and be flexible as opposed to thinking short term and being rigid. Who would have thought? That's a good idea, Kelly.
It is a good idea, but it's surprising how much the energy market, as Chris talked about, is really done on short term. Like, what should we do in the next 5 years, as opposed to what do we need the energy system to look like in the next 30 years? So this is really about wanting decision makers and energy companies to be a lot more forward looking. And that really helps with things like innovation. It helps with decisions about investment. Where do you put the money? You know, should we be propping coal companies up in the short term because it does X, or should we be out there investing in helping households, more households put solar and improving the ability of the networks to cater for more DER? Is that where we should be putting money? Or should we, you know, be putting money in helping coal-fired power stations stay open? So these are, you know, if we think long term, then we can be more innovative and be more efficient in how we spend our money so that we don't waste resources, and that we can be more flexible and really looking at what's in the best interest of people in the long term, as opposed to the market or, you know, certain players in the short term. So, I mean, there's a descriptor here which, you know, basically talks about what I've just said and acknowledges that clean energy is about not just the electricity, but transport. And we've talked about, you know, electric vehicles, but also the fact that we are becoming more digital and more decentralized. So we need to take all of this into account as we're thinking about the future energy system.
Again, any responses into the chat? People are really using it. We really, really appreciate it. This is really working as an exercise at the moment, guys. So keep the comments going in and we'll move to our 3rd principle, which is to be just and fair. Again, you know, in a way self-evident, but the fact that this needs to be put into the mix probably says a little bit about where we've gone as a society. I was just reflecting, Kelly, that we don't want to end up in a world where clean, cheap, renewable is kind of like organic food and it's only sort of a certain class of wealthier, more educated people that access it, and you know, you've got another cohort that are eating Maccas. You know, you want to create a world where this is a shared resource and there's a shared engagement. That's kind of what you're driving at here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first sentence really says it all. It's about, you know, designing an energy transition that's just, fair and inclusive and ensures that no one is left behind. Like I said, we can't just design it for, you know, people interested in technology and can afford to or are able to access it. And as Chris said before, it's also not just about the people engaging in the energy, but it's about the workers and the communities that are also going to be impacted by the change in the energy system. So ensuring that we've got in place policies and regulations that make sure workers are looked after and that communities are looked after as well as part of the transition.
So again, I know there's been some really great comments previously just about the importance of accessing people in public housing, for instance, to to rooftop solar. We had Mark talking about the idea of community solar farms. So again, your feedback to this idea of justice and fairness as a foundation stone, great to get it in the chat. I also recognise we're coming up to the hour now. People that are regular Australia at Homes would automatically pilot to turn off. We're probably going to go for another 10, 15 minutes if people can stay with it. It's great if you can. If you need to go, you'll get an email out later with a survey to fill out that will just really round out this consultation and would just be awesome. So on that note, we'll move through to the fourth, which is kind of ensure it works. Why we had to put this in here, is this a reaction to the idea that the grid's not stable, Kelly, or what's going on here?
So, I talked about earlier that there is a national energy objective already, and the national energy objective is essentially the ensure it works. So make sure that it's reliable, securable, and affordable. And we absolutely don't want to lose those three things. So we're saying that that was an important principle and should still be an important principle. In here, we talk about, we've moved away from the language of reliable and secure, and we're using dependable because of the word that Mark mentioned right at the beginning is being more resilient as well. So, this year is a classic example where the bushfires that we saw and even the storms we see now has just had massive impacts on people's access to energy, not just in the short term, but for some people, weeks and months after. And that moving to a decentralised system, for example, can actually make our system more resilient. So this really is going back to that core, that it's got to be affordable, it's got to be reliable, secure, and resilient.
On that note, I think with us, did you get through the hailstone? Mark, are you there?
Yes.
Phew, how was it?
Pretty hairy. Sorry, everyone. I thought I'd better go offline while the bursts of the hail and the lightning passed. Yeah.
Well, we're just working our way through, and we were just talking about the energy system should be resilient to extreme weather and security. So on that note, I guess one of the real roadblocks in the last 3 or 4 years was those big storms in South Australia, which created this huge panic that we couldn't really transition because the whole thing would go kaput.
Yeah.
Oh, go on, Kelly.
I was going to say, there was a lot of myths around that, but in some respects, it really did put fire under everybody to start thinking about this in more detail. So, there were some good things that actually came out of that in terms of us being a little bit more focused about what needs to happen. But, a lot of myths about what actually happened.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go, Mark. Yeah.
There are some real technical challenges, but there are solutions to all of them. And even the market operator is saying we can get to 90% renewables by 2040 with no problem. And others are saying 100% renewables by 2030. So it's all technically possible, as we go on their merry way, led by South Australia, which is really at the cutting edge here.
Great. And our final principle, and again, please feed back on that into the chat, as I know you're doing. This is really the win at the end of it, isn't it? We get this right?
Yeah, and look, I should just say that these principles are in no particular order. So, we see them as all equal. But yes, we should be designing the system to deliver clean and healthy energy. So it as I said right at the top of this session, it's about making sure that our energy system supports our responsibility to reduce global warming and reduce our emissions. And to do so, and also to ensure that it's healthy for people as well, and sustainable for the planet. So it's really about putting some guidelines around that as well.
Terrific. So again, any feedback in the chat, 1 or 2 words, love it, hate it. I think we'll get a pretty good resounding response to that one. Kelly, have we got one more slide we want to go through before we come up for air?
I think that was it. I just
okay, great.
thing about the just and fair, you know, it's often argued that it's not up to the energy market to be just and fair, that that's government policy. But, you know, it's absolutely not true. Government policy is important, but the rules and regulations around how costs of the system are allocated and how we do things can really influence that just and fair nature. So I just wanted to emphasise that there is absolutely a role for the market, for the regulators and energy companies to be ensuring that it's a just and fair transition and not just up to governments.
Great. So I guess I still struggle, and I've been through this a few times. So we agree on the principles, and then the kind of the job of civil society with the support of ECA is then to bring those principles to life in something that is meaningful and actionable. I'm really interested, just as a final piece, if people want to put the sense in the chat, but there'll also be a chance in the feedback form. A, would you endorse these principles? Is there anything here that's missing? If you're thinking, what does energy mean to me? What is missing? And do you think, as we've portrayed it, it hangs together? And while you're responding to that, there are a few people that are happy to come up. I'm really keen to have to put their feedback sort of publicly. Firstly, I'd like to call up Colin, who had a few comments that he sent me in the chat. Are you there, Colin? Sorry, I'm now forcing my guys to quickly go and unmute Colin. That's my bad. And then after that, if she's happy to come online, I'm going to ask Penelope, who's been putting some really interesting challenges to us in the chat as well. So, Colin, are you there now?
Yes.
So, what's your response to all this?
Look, I think the principles are really good, and I'm very pleased to see the principle talking about fairness, including for workers, because I work for the trade union movement, and our experience is that jobs in renewable energy are often not great quality, and they're often insecure, which is the great curse of the Australian labour market at the moment, and often certainly not as well paid as fossil fuel sector jobs. So it'd be great to see improvements, and we are having discussions with the industry, but it'd be great to see improvements in labour standards and wages.
Yeah. Are you guys engaging with the unions and the workforce through this process, Chris and Kelly?
Well, ACOS certainly works closely with the unions on a whole lot of aspects around energy. We're part of the Australian Climate Roundtable, which ACTU and the CFMEU are part of as well. I'm not sure we had union representatives in the original workshop, but we're holding some more stakeholder meetings so that there's an opportunity for unions to engage more there. But certainly, you know, it's been front of mind for us, the issues that Colin talked about as well.
Great. I'm going to call Penelope up now, if you're happy to go on camera, because it's come through to me privately. I don't know if you want to share it publicly, but some sort of challenges to the way this is rolling out. Are you there, Penelope?
Yes, I am.
Hi, thanks for joining us.
You're
so you're saying we're lacking passion and clarity. What would you like to see that's not here?
Well, I think if you have to go through the 5 points to try and get an understanding of what was actually meant, I think that creates a real problem for me. I facilitate people getting their visions together all the time. And one of the things that I find is that there's it's not bold enough. It's not bold enough and it's not clear enough. This is a key infrastructure. I call it part of a cradle of infrastructure that will determine how our society, how our civil society develops in the future, or whether in fact it continues to tear at its fabric. And I have a real concern that we keep talking about not leaving people behind. And it sounds almost like a charity.
It's a really good point, because we were saying before, if people aren't involved, the system's not going to work. They actually need us as much as we need them. That's where we've got to get to in this language, isn't it?
It is, and it's across a whole lot of things. And the opportunity that COVID has provided to us is the opportunity to be bold and insistent. And we're already diverging and we're already behind. No matter how many conversations people are having, if they're not having the conversations with the right people, that is with the community people, then we're not going to get that traction that we need.
That's great feedback. I don't know if any of you guys, it's not like we're defending this. This is one of the big risks we make in research is to try to win the research. What we really need to do is take the insights in. Chris?
I think Chris needs to be taken.
That's better. I think they're great comments, Penelope. We had it put to us by an academic, Cameron Tonkinwise, at a session we did earlier in the year, that we're all involved in a civilization-saving activity. And I think it's one of the challenges we've got for people that work in the energy sector, and that includes consumer advocates like us, is that you get drawn into this kind of technical, process-orientated ways of thinking and communicating and explaining what we actually want. And it's that, as you drift into that territory, you leave people behind and you leave the clarity behind. So I think one of the things we've really struggled with in this process is how do you kind of frame and lay out exactly what we're about here, which is fundamentally about bringing people into a system that's kind of tended to exclude them and get this massive new opportunity. I mean, ultimately, we could be getting to a point where energy's free. Like how empowering would that be for people? So, I mean, that passion is there, and we need to make sure it comes through in.
Would it work for the energy companies, Chris?
No, it wouldn't. And I mean, that's why we've got to be in on the design here, because it wouldn't work for the energy companies, but that's where we could possibly get to.
Even starting back from the design from the original point, because the use of the word affordable, to me, my concern about that is just because I can afford to pay for it, should that be the determinant of how much I'm prepared to pay, which I then think plays into that whole charitable notion about a community. So as a facilitator between, I work in culture, workplace culture. And one of the things I know is that if I do a survey through the leadership of organisations, they will often say nothing to see here. If I do a survey through all of the organisation, including the cleaners and the people who often are not even heard in organisations, they will say something completely different to me. And it's sort of, somehow you need a language conduit between the two before you can get where you want to go. Otherwise, you end up having 5 principles of aspirations. That's my concern.
Thanks a lot for that. And that's kind of the whole point of this exercise, obviously. Peter Johnson had some interesting comments in chat. Are you happy to share, Peter?
Sure, Peter, thanks. A pretty basic question about tidal energy. I hear very little said about it. It would seem to me that it's 100% reliable at source, more reliable, in fact, than wind and solar energy. I can only assume there are difficulties of some sort in harvesting it, but I'd be interested to know if there's much research going on in that area, whether it's seen as a technical or cost possibility.
Peter, I can try and answer that question, but if there's anyone that's more of a technical expert, please jump in. There were pilot studies and still are pilot studies going on around tidal and wave as well, so slightly different but similar sort of concepts, especially along Western Australia. There were some pilots, but my understanding is that it wasn't as efficient or cost efficient, so you weren't getting as much bang for your buck from tidal as what you do from wind and solar. But if there's anyone there that...
I was just going to say, Kelly, and Peter, I'm no expert on tidal power, but I used to work in the UK, and there's a project there that's worth Googling called Swansea Bay. That's been a really controversial one. I don't think it's ever got off the drawing boards, but like the economics of it without an awful lot of government support, like heaps of government support compared to, say, wind and some of these other technologies. It wasn't really coming close. That's not to say it won't ever materialise, though.
So what comes next, guys? This is really interesting. That the feedback's really useful. Obviously, this isn't the only consultation you're undertaking, but what happens after you land this compact? What are the next steps after that?
Thanks, Peter. So I think there's a couple of important things. We envisage this to be a living document, so that it's something that may evolve over time as community expectations, science, etc., evolve as well, so that perhaps to Penelope's point, it can get bolder. But what we want to do next is, once we finalise it, which we aim to do by early next year, is we will look to get endorsements from organisations that represent consumers or consumers themselves, so that we can use it to engage with the decision makers and the energy companies. We also want some of those decision makers to support it. I don't know that endorse is a word that they would use, but to agree to use the framework in their processes, in their consultations as they go forward. And we're actively having conversations with them about that. So that would be the very next thing. Well, we'll be having parallel conversations, I should say. And then down the track, as Chris said, you know, when we demonstrate how important these principles are, we would hope that they would actually become part of legislation, so ingrained, so that, you know, people have to pay attention to them. So that's
right.
Next steps for us.
All right. Well, one last survey. Having heard what you've heard, and Caitlin's going to line up now, I hope, how likely would you be to endorse the compact and provide feedback about the energy market? Hopefully we're going to get a good result on this. At the moment, we've got 1 out of 1. Hopefully it will be a mirror image of the level of trust we have in energy companies. It's looking pretty good at the moment, guys. And I know that those of you who have stayed around are probably now what we call a captive audience, but it has been fantastic getting your really rich insights in the chat and just being part of this. You know, the participation is great for ECA. Frankly, it's great for Australia at home as well, because it's proving the value of this network we're creating. So for those of you that are regulars, you've really given us something today too that we really appreciate. We've got 74 out of 98. I reckon, given our the number of people that maybe leave their cameras on, that's probably enough to get there. So 54 very likely, guys. So that's a pretty good result. 33 somewhat likely. 1 solitary not very likely. And whoever we are, we'll dig you out and have another conversation to try to convince you otherwise. And nobody saying not at all, even though I misspelt that as at all. Okay, I think that's about it. Thanks to Mark for weathering the storm, and Chris and Kelly, and also thanks for trusting us to run this consult. The final thing is, we're going to put in the chat now, but we're also going to email it out to you, a survey that we reckon will take between 5 and 10 minutes. It would really be the icing on the cake if you could just go through and fill that out as well, because, you know, these guys are on the side of the angels. They're trying to create a way that the energy market works for people. So the more help we can give them, then I think the better for all of us. For those of you that aren't regulars, we run these events 2 or 3 times a week. Next week is a bumper week, and you're really welcome back. Tuesday, we've got Catherine Murphy from The Guardian talking the latest politics with the Political Geek Fest. Wednesday, we're going to, and this will be another experiment, we're going to have an election watch party. We're basically just going to open the doors at 11 and keep them open until they go to bed in America. So the idea is that people can watch the results coming in, but if you don't feel like just getting angry on Twitter or just, you know, being in a padded room, we can at least share either the joy or the pain across our community. Then we will be doing on the Thursday a post-mortem with a special panel, particularly with some lawyers from Morris Blackburn, because I think the likelihood is that the story the day after the voting is going to be what happens in the courts. And then on Friday, it's such a big week, Guardian Book Club with Helen Garner. So there's some really fun stuff over the next week. So that's your thank you for being part of today's consultation. Thanks for hanging around. 16 minutes past our normal bedtime, but go well, everybody, and particularly those that are in Melbourne. Go out and get some air. You can do it at last, and that's fantastic as well. So thanks, everybody. And, yeah, the survey is in there. Please fill it out. And, yeah, that was a great little experiment. So thank you all for being part of it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.